Verse 25, don't worry about life. It's the Greek word suke, meaning the temporal physical life.
He spent a lifetime speaking with certainty, standing firm when others backed down, and telling millions exactly what he believed God was saying. But as he nears the end of that journey, John Hagee has admitted something no one expected. What happens when a man built on strength runs into limits he can't preach away? Once you understand what he has admitted, his rise, controversies, and unwavering endurance start to look very different. The rise of John Hagee. For decades, John Hagee has been one of the most recognizable voices in American evangelical Christianity. His style is direct, his sermons are blunt, his delivery leaves very little room for ambiguity. Supporters describe him as fearless. Critics call him confrontational. But one thing is undeniable: Hagee has never been easy to ignore. Behind the pulpit, he projects certainty, strength, conviction. Yet the personal road that brought him there and the heartbreaking admissions he would later make are far from the image he projects behind the pulpit. John Charles Hagee was born on April 12, 1940, in Baytown, Texas, then known as Goose Creek. He was raised in a Christian household where faith wasn't treated as a weekend activity, but as a daily structure. Church life shaped his routines early on, and preaching was something embedded from the beginning. Education became a central part of his preparation for the ministry work. He earned a Bachelor of Science degree from Southwestern Assemblies of God University in Waxahachie, Texas, followed by another Bachelor of Science degree from Trinity University in San Antonio. Rather than stopping there, Hagee went on to complete a master's degree in educational administration at the University of North Texas in Denton. But his earliest years in ministry were not marked by instant success. In the 1960s, Hagee began preaching at a time when competition among churches was intense, and congregations were slow to grow. Attendance was modest. Momentum was difficult. Like many young pastors, he faced uncertainty about whether his ministry would ever reach beyond a small local audience. In 1966, Hagee founded Trinity Church in San Antonio, but in 1975, his path took an unexpected turn when he resigned from Trinity Church. He then assumed leadership of a much smaller congregation, roughly 25 members, at what was then known as the Church at Castle Hills. What followed over the next decades would change his trajectory entirely. Under Hagee's leadership, that small congregation expanded rapidly. Facilities were rededicated, buildings were added, and attendance grew year after year. Eventually, the church became known as Cornerstone Church, a megachurch reporting tens of thousands of active members. Its size placed it among the most influential churches in the United States. As the congregation expanded, so did Hagee's reach beyond physical walls. He founded John Hagee Ministries, using broadcast media to carry sermons across the United States and into Canada. Television became a turning point. His programming later expanded globally through networks like Trinity Broadcasting Network, allowing his sermons to reach millions who would never step inside Cornerstone Church. Hagee also authored numerous titles focused on prophecy, theology, Christian living, and the future of faith in a changing world. Among the most widely discussed were his teachings on biblical prophecy and end-times theology, including his emphasis on the blood moon phenomenon, a subject that brought both attention and controversy. One theme, however, has remained constant and unmistakable: his support for Israel. Hagee became one of the most prominent evangelical advocates for Christian Zionism in the United States. In 2006, he founded Christians United for Israel, commonly known as CUFI. What began as an organized effort to mobilize evangelical support quickly grew into the largest pro-Israel organization in America. By this point, Hagee was no longer simply a pastor. He had become an influential and polarizing national figure, deeply embedded in American religious and political discourse. Yet with all of this visibility came an assumption that Hagee's personal life mirrored the certainty he projected publicly, that his faith never wavered, that his convictions never softened, that time had only strengthened his resolve without changing anything beneath the surface. That assumption, it turns out, wasn't entirely true. As Hagee entered the later stages of his life, he he began to acknowledge something rarely associated with his public image: vulnerability. This admission came after years of being caught in several controversial and defining moments of his career. John Hagee's unapologetic stances. John Hagee has never presented himself as a pastor trying to soften difficult topics. He was clear from the beginning that he believed a preacher's job was to confront, not accommodate. That approach became most visible in his statements about sexuality, gender, and social change. Over the years, Hagee made several comments about the queer community that drew widespread criticism. One of the most cited was his claim, made during a sermon, that the Antichrist would be queer and half Jewish. The statement triggered immediate backlash from religious leaders, civil rights groups, and political figures, who called it offensive and discriminatory. Critics argued that it framed entire groups of people as inherently connected to evil rather than addressing behavior or belief. Hagee did not retract the statement in a traditional apology. Instead, his responses followed a familiar pattern. He framed his words as theological commentary rooted in his reading of Scripture, not as an attack meant to harm individuals. That explanation did little to calm critics, but it reinforced a pattern that would define his public image. He rarely walked statements back, even when they caused outrage. Another major flashpoint came in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina in 2005. In a sermon delivered shortly after the disaster, Hagee suggested that the destruction of New Orleans was a form of divine judgment, pointing specifically to the city's tolerance of the queer community. The remark was met with sharp condemnation across religious, political, and media circles. Many saw it as an attempt to assign moral blame to a natural disaster that had already caused immense suffering. Once again, Hagee did not deny making the statement. He defended it as a biblical worldview, arguing that societies experience consequences when they move away from what he defined as God's standards. The controversy significantly expanded public awareness of his views, especially among people who had never watched his sermons before. Reproductive autonomy was another area where Hagee's position was unwavering. He consistently condemned the practice, framing it as a violation of biblical principles and moral law. In his preaching and writing, he described it as incompatible with Christian belief, and he supported political efforts aimed at restricting access. While his language varied over time, the position itself remained firm and aligned closely with broader conservative evangelical activism. On queer community rights, Hagee repeatedly preached that such relationships and gender nonconformity conflicted with biblical teaching. He opposed legal protections and social movements that normalized these identities, arguing that acceptance by society did not equal approval by God. However, as cultural pressure increased and political landscapes shifted, Hagee's tone began to change slightly, though not entirely. In later years, he softened his opposition to certain local non-discrimination ordinances, particularly those framed around housing or employment. This shift was limited and cautious. He did not reverse his theological stance, but he acknowledged that some policies could exist without threatening religious freedom. And yet, even among all these controversies, one moment would later stand out as uniquely damaging because it touched one of history's darkest chapters: the Holocaust controversy. One of the most serious controversies in John Hagee's career came from a statement tied to the Holocaust, and it would follow him for years. In a past sermon, Hagee made a claim that shocked even some of his supporters. He said that God had sent Adolf Hitler to help bring about the creation of the State of Israel. The remark was meant to fit into his larger belief that major historical events unfold according to divine plans. But the way it was framed caused immediate outrage. Many people saw the statement as deeply offensive. Hitler was responsible for a deeply horrific period in history. Suggesting that his actions served a divine purpose was widely condemned as insensitive and harmful. Jewish leaders, historians, and civil rights groups rejected the idea outright, arguing that it distorted history and minimized the horror of the Holocaust. The controversy did not explode immediately when the sermon was first delivered. Instead, it resurfaced years later when Hagee became more visible in political and pro-Israel spaces. As founder and chairman of Christians United for Israel, Hagee regularly appeared at rallies, conferences, and events focused on supporting Israel. And so, when old clips and transcripts of the Hitler remark began circulating again, criticism intensified. Jewish organizations were especially vocal. Some acknowledged Hagee's strong support for Israel, but argued that support did not erase the damage caused by earlier statements. Political figures also weighed in, questioning whether someone with that history should be given prominent platforms at events tied to fighting anti-Semitism. Hagee's defense was consistent with how he had handled past backlash. He argued that his words had been misunderstood. According to him, the point was not to excuse Hitler or justify his crimes, but to say that God can bring outcomes from even the worst acts of evil. The issue returned to national attention again in 2023 during the March for Israel rally in Washington, D.C. The event was organized as a response to rising anti-Semitism, and Hagee was listed as one of the speakers. Almost immediately, his past comments were brought back into public debate. Media coverage focused heavily on whether his presence undermined the message of the rally. Some Jewish groups protested his inclusion, arguing that statements like his had no place at an event meant to confront anti-Semitism. Others defended him, pointing to his decades of outspoken support for Israel and his leadership within CUFI. This was not the first time Hagee faced accusations tied to anti-Semitism. Over the years, critics also pointed to earlier remarks that were interpreted as hostile toward Jewish people and Catholics. While he consistently described himself as a defender of Israel and the Jewish state, his rhetoric sometimes clashed with how Jewish communities understood their own history and trauma. The tension created a complicated public image. On one hand, Hagee helped mobilize millions of evangelical Christians in support of Israel. On the other hand, his language repeatedly reopened old wounds and sparked questions about whether political alignment could outweigh historical sensitivity. Eventually, the pressure forced Hagee to address another group he had offended in earlier years through direct apology: Hagee's apology to the Catholic Church. For years, John Hagee's strongest critics were not only secular groups or political opponents. Some of the most sustained backlash came from within Christianity itself, especially from the Catholic Church. In earlier sermons and writings, Hagee had used harsh language to describe Catholicism. He reportedly referred to the Catholic Church as an apostate church. In other statements, he reportedly went further, suggesting that Adolf Hitler's anti-Semitism was influenced by his Catholic upbringing. These remarks circulated for years within religious circles but remained mostly outside the national spotlight. That changed in 2008. During the U.S. presidential race, Hagee publicly endorsed John McCain. At the time, McCain was the Republican nominee, and the endorsement immediately drew attention. Journalists and advocacy groups began reviewing Hagee's past sermons and writings. The old comments about Catholics resurfaced almost overnight. Catholic leaders reacted strongly. Many said the language was offensive, inaccurate, and rooted in long-standing religious hostility. Some argued that Hagee's comments reduced complex history to blame and stereotypes. Others focused on the political implications, calling on McCain to reject the endorsement altogether. The pressure built quickly. Catholic organizations released statements condemning Hagee's rhetoric. Among the most vocal was the Catholic League, which accused him of promoting anti-Catholic bigotry and misrepresenting history. Media coverage intensified, and what had been a religious dispute turned into a national political problem. McCain responded publicly. He distanced himself from Hagee, stating that he did not share or support the views expressed in those past remarks. The endorsement effectively collapsed under the weight of the controversy. For Hagee, this moment was different from previous backlash. The criticism was not limited to activists or commentators. It came from a major Christian institution during a highly visible political moment, with consequences that reached beyond his ministry. Within weeks, Hagee took a step he had rarely taken before. On May 12, 2008, he sent a formal letter to Bill Donahue, the president of the Catholic League. The letter was direct and unambiguous. In it, Hagee wrote, "I want to express my deep regret for any comments that Catholics have found hurtful." He went further. In the same letter, Hagee acknowledged that his past teachings had focused too heavily on conflict. He admitted that he had emphasized the darkest chapters in the history of Catholic and Protestant relations with the Jews, and said he intended to offer a more balanced portrayal going forward. This was not a defense. It was not an explanation. It was an apology. The response was swift. After reviewing the letter, the Catholic League announced that it considered the matter resolved. Public statements followed, confirming that the organization accepted Hagee's apology and regarded the controversy as closed. For many observers, the moment stood out because it contrasted sharply with how Hagee had handled criticism in the past. In earlier controversies, he often explained, clarified, or reframed his words. This time, he acknowledged harm and expressed regret without conditions. Supporters viewed the apology as a sign of maturity and accountability. Critics saw it as necessary but long overdue. Either way, it marked a rare moment where Hagee adjusted his public posture in response to sustained pressure. After 2008, Hagee largely avoided direct attacks on Catholicism in his public preaching. While theological differences remained, the language that had fueled the controversy faded from the forefront of his messaging. It also opened a window into another side of his life, one less visible than sermons and rallies, because behind the public controversies and institutional battles was a private life shaped by relationships, loss, and change. Hagee's enduring marriage. John Hagee's personal life has followed a very different path from the certainty he projects from the pulpit. Long before the megachurch, the television ministry, and the political influence, his family life went through a public collapse that nearly ended everything he was building. His first marriage began early. In 1960, Hagee married Martha Downing. At the time, he was still finding his footing as a preacher. The two were rooted in Texas, and their life together unfolded while Hagee was studying, preaching, and trying to establish credibility in ministry. Very little was publicly documented about how they met or courted, but their marriage took place during a formative period when his ambitions were growing faster than his platform. They had 2 children together, Christopher and Tish. By the late 1960s and early 70s, Hagee's ministry responsibilities were increasing. He was preaching more often, managing church leadership, and trying to grow a congregation in a competitive religious environment. The pressure of ministry and public expectation was constant, and it began to strain his personal life. In 1975, the situation became public. Hagee sent a letter to his congregation admitting to what he called immorality. That admission confirmed reports that he had been unfaithful to Martha. According to accounts from that period, the affair involved another woman, and the revelation shook the church leadership. The consequences were immediate. That same year, the marriage ended in divorce. Hagee resigned from Trinity Church in San Antonio, the church he had founded in 1966. For a conservative evangelical pastor in the 1970s, this kind of scandal was often career-ending. His reputation suffered badly. Critics questioned his fitness for leadership. Supporters were divided. Some believed he should step away from ministry altogether. Others believed he could rebuild, but only with time and accountability. For a moment, his future as a public pastor looked uncertain. But instead of disappearing, Hagee restarted. Shortly after leaving Trinity Church, he took leadership of a much smaller congregation with only a few dozen members, and it became the foundation for his return to prominence. Less than a year after his divorce, Hagee remarried. On April 12, 1976, he married Diana Castro. Diana had been a member of his congregation during his earlier ministry years, and their relationship developed within the church environment. This second marriage unfolded very differently from the first. From the beginning, Diana played an active role in church life. She was not positioned as a pastor's spouse who stayed behind the scenes. Over time, she became deeply involved in ministry leadership, eventually serving as a co-pastor at Cornerstone Church. Together, they had 3 children, Matthew, Christina, and Sandy. As Hagee rebuilt his public standing, his family became part of the ministry's visible structure. Services, conferences, and broadcasts increasingly featured Diana alongside him. Their partnership was presented as unified and consistent, a sharp contrast to the turmoil of his earlier years. The family's involvement extended beyond preaching. The Hagees performed together musically under the name the Hagees, combining worship music with sermons and ministry events. This helped reinforce a family-centered image at a time when trust had to be rebuilt. For many followers, seeing the family together symbolized stability and renewal. Diana's influence within the ministry grew steadily. She became recognized not only as a co-pastor, but also as an author and preacher in her own right. Her presence in John Hagee Ministries and at Cornerstone Church was constant. She appeared regularly in broadcasts and church leadership settings, supporting both the organizational and spiritual direction of the ministry. Over the decades, this second marriage endured. While Hagee faced repeated public controversies related to theology, politics, and social issues, his home life appeared steady. Unlike the first marriage, there were no public scandals tied to his family. That consistency became part of how supporters defended him against criticism, pointing to decades of marriage as evidence of personal stability. What is clear is that Hagee's current public identity is closely tied to this long-standing partnership. Diana's role is not symbolic. She has been central to the ministry's expansion, its internal culture, and its outward presentation. Together, they built Cornerstone Church into a megachurch and sustained a global television ministry that reaches millions. And yet, marriage alone does not explain how John Hagee became who he is today. Because beyond family, theology, and controversy lies a man who has faced turmoil and has lived to tell the story. The truth about John Hagee. John Hagee is currently 85 years old, and for someone who spent most of his adult life preaching multiple times a week, traveling constantly, and leading large organizations, age has brought realities that can no longer be ignored. In recent years, Hagee has spoken openly about physical limits, something he rarely addressed earlier in his career. For decades, his public image was built around strength and stamina, long sermons, packed schedules, back-to-back services, conferences, television broadcasts, and national events. That pace took a toll, even if it wasn't visible at first. The first major public sign came in 2008. At age 68, Hagee went in for what he described as a routine medical checkup. During that visit, doctors discovered a blocked artery. The finding surprised him and those around him because he had continued working at full speed without obvious warning signs. The situation was serious enough that doctors recommended immediate surgery. Hagee underwent open-heart surgery that same year. The procedure lasted roughly 3 hours. Recovery required several weeks away from the pulpit, a rare pause in a career defined by constant presence. When he returned to preaching, he spoke openly about the experience, acknowledging for the first time that his health was fragile. That moment marked a shift. It was no longer possible to pretend that physical strength was unlimited. In later years, Hagee revealed that his heart issues were more severe than many realized. He disclosed that he had survived a 4-way bypass surgery, a major cardiovascular procedure that underscored how serious his condition had become. This was not a minor medical setback, it was a life-threatening situation. Hagee described the surgery as a turning point. He credited his survival to God's grace and spoke about the experience as a reminder of mortality. While his message remained rooted in faith, the tone was noticeably different. There was less emphasis on invincibility and more acknowledgement of human limits. But the heart surgeries were not the only challenge. At one point, Hagee admitted that he was battling a disease that threatened his voice. For most people, losing one's voice would be an inconvenience. For Hagee, it was something much deeper. His entire ministry depended on speaking, preaching, teaching, and broadcasting. The possibility that he might no longer be able to preach forced him to confront a future he had never seriously considered. He spoke about the condition publicly, describing it as one of the most difficult trials he had faced. The issue was not just physical, it was existential. If he could not preach, who was he? What would his role be? That question lingered quietly beneath his public appearances. Even as he continued preaching, the effects of age became more apparent. His schedule adjusted. His appearances became more selective. Others began taking on larger roles within the ministry. These were not sudden changes, but gradual ones, shaped by necessity rather than announcement. At 85, Hagee no longer presents himself as a man immune to time. Instead, he has acknowledged that decades of leadership, travel, and pressure left lasting marks on his body and forced him to slow down in ways he had resisted earlier in life. What makes this phase of his life notable is not just the medical details, but the transparency. For much of his career, vulnerability was not part of his public persona. Strength was emphasized. Certainty was projected. In later years, that posture softened. He has spoken about endurance rather than dominance, survival rather than expansion, continuity rather than growth at all costs. For supporters, these admissions humanized him. They saw a man who had carried responsibility for decades finally acknowledging the cost. For critics, the health struggles added context to a long career marked by controversy and intensity. And while health has slowed him, it has not removed him from influence, because behind the surgeries, the aging, and the physical limits is another reality: the constant pressure that comes with building and sustaining one of the most visible ministries in America. Long before health issues forced John Hagee to slow down, the pressure of leadership was already constant. Leading Cornerstone Church was not a part-time responsibility. With a congregation reported to exceed 20,000 members, every decision carried weight. Sermons were not just messages. They shaped the direction of thousands of families. Staffing, finances, construction, counseling, and discipline all flowed upward. There was also the expectation of visibility. In a megachurch, the senior pastor is not just a teacher. He is the face of the institution. Hagee was expected to be present, decisive, and consistent, even during moments of personal strain. Growth brought influence, but it also eliminated privacy. Mistakes were magnified. Fatigue had to be hidden. Beyond the local church, the demands multiplied. John Hagee Ministries expanded into a global broadcast operation. Sermons aired daily across the United States and internationally, reaching millions. That reach required consistency. Content could not pause simply because the leader was tired or unwell. Messages had to be delivered on schedule. Production teams, donors, and viewers all depended on continuity. That kind of ministry carries emotional weight. Speaking to millions means knowing that words matter deeply. Every sermon could inspire, offend, or provoke backlash. For decades, Hagee carried that responsibility without extended breaks. The physical strain of travel was matched by the mental strain of knowing his words would be replayed, dissected, and criticized far beyond his control. Then there was the political dimension. As founder of Christians United for Israel, Hagee stepped into a role that combined faith with activism. CUFI placed him at the center of national and international political conversations. He addressed lawmakers, organized large-scale events, and mobilized millions of supporters. This role came with intense scrutiny. Political advocacy invites opposition, media attention, and constant criticism. Statements made in religious settings were now evaluated through political lenses. Every appearance carried the risk of controversy. The pressure was not just to lead, but to represent an entire movement accurately and consistently. Balancing pastoral care with political advocacy is demanding. One role asks for compassion and patience. The other demands firmness and public positioning. For Hagee, these roles overlapped daily, adding to the mental and emotional load he carried for years. As age became impossible to ignore, another pressure emerged: succession. Hagee began speaking openly about the importance of preparing the next generation. His son, Matt Hagee, gradually took on more visible leadership responsibilities. This was not just a family decision. It was an institutional one. Transitioning leadership in a megachurch is delicate. Congregations resist sudden change. Donors look for stability. Staff needs clarity. Hagee understood that stepping back too quickly could create uncertainty, while stepping back too slowly could risk burnout or crisis. He has acknowledged that letting go is difficult. For decades, the ministry moved at his pace and under his authority. Preparing a successor meant trusting others to carry what he built. That includes sermons, vision, and responsibility. At this stage of his life, the pressure is no longer about expansion. It is about endurance and continuity. The question is no longer how much more can be built, but how what already exists can last. And that weight may be heavier than any single controversy he ever faced. What do you think about Pastor John Hagee? Drop your thoughts in the comment section below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click on the next video on your screen, like this video, and subscribe to our channel for more updates.